Good evening. I want to thank Mike for that nice introduction. I want to thank Sue Holmes for her introduction and for arranging this event tonight, and Tom too, and for your amazing activism over all these many years. I've worked with Sue on Fighting Bob Fest and a whole number of other things, and I'm amazed at her energy and in her intelligence and in her commitment. I want to thank also UW Baraboo for hosting this event and the other co-sponsors of the event. I do still call it UW Baraboo. I want to thank Dean Gennaro for letting this go forward. I want to thank Officer Nick for being here to make sure there's nothing untoward that goes on. I want to thank Sauk-Prairie Indy, who's filming this, and you can find that on YouTube. It's nice to see so many old friends here as well. I want to thank you for coming. I hope I don't disappoint you. I know some of you may have wanted to go down to Madison for the protest of that outrageous lame duck session that's going on. And so I hope I make this worth your time. And for those of you who don't know me, I want to thank you for coming tonight. I want to thank you for your concern and interest in this issue about how democracies die. I want to thank you for your concern about what's going on in this country right now and for what's been going on in Baraboo. And I'm not here to single out Baraboo. That picture could have been taken in almost any community in this country. That doesn't make it any better, but it is to say that Donald Trump has given a permission slip to every single person in the United States who is bigoted and racist to be out in the open with their bigotry and with their racism. And it's horrifying to me that people are giving the Nazi salute in America, or that they're waving Nazi flags as they did in Charlottesville in the streets of America. My father fought against the Nazis in Europe, as I'm sure many of your fathers did, or your grandfathers, and probably many of the great-grandfathers of those students fought against Hitler. And, you know, it was only 75 years ago that the Nazis were putting people like me, Jews, into gas chambers and then extracting the gold from our teeth. It was just 75 years ago that the Nazis were rounding up and killing gays and people with disabilities. It was just 75 years ago that Nazi doctors were experimenting on young Jewish twins. And sometimes when we talk about the Holocaust, or we talk about 5 million people, Jews being killed in the Holocaust, it's lost in that statistic. But, you know, when you look at it from an individual's perspective or a family's perspective of young Jewish kids being torn away from their parents and sent straight into the gas chambers and then the ovens, it becomes a little more immediate. I mean, there's nothing cute about giving the Nazi salute. There's nothing, you know, anti-PC about giving the Nazi salute. And so to see these Baraboo kids giving the Heil Hitler salute was, to say the least, extremely disturbing to me as a Jewish American, as a student of history, as a progressive activist. And let me assure you at the outset that I am not interested whatsoever in seeing these kids punished. But I am interested in seeing that the kids get an education. I am interested in seeing that the kids, that they understand what Nazism was all about. And what was it about? It was about bigotry. It was about scapegoating. It was about nationalism. It was about genocide. It was about killing families, kids, experimenting on people, doing the most unthinkable things. And it was within our lifetimes, many of us, or you know, a generation or two ago. It's not that far away. It's not ancient history. And so I kind of like to see a little bit more done by the school district. It's not adequate to hide behind the First Amendment, much as I love the First Amendment. It's not adequate to say we love all our students no matter what their views are. As Superintendent Miller said 2 weeks ago at the high school. I was at the high school for that event. And she also said that the community wants to be left alone to heal, and I certainly can understand that impulse. I'm sure no one wants to see your community defined by this incident, and it won't be defined by this incident ultimately. But I agree with Rabbi Lori Zimmerman, who also spoke that evening, and she cautioned that it would be a mistake to try to put this incident behind you without first coming to grips with the rise of anti-Semitism and the rise of white supremacy that this incident reflects. And that's all it does. It doesn't reflect Baraboo. It reflects America in the age of Trump. That's where we're at. And I want to cut to the chase here. I'm worried to death about the health of our democracy here in the United States. I'm fearful, actually very fearful, that our vaunted system of checks and balances might not be up to the task right now. Our democracy is hanging by a thread, and that thread might not hold. And even before Donald Trump, we were in trouble. You know, a lot of publications this time of year are doing surveys of the best books of the year. Here's my nomination. This is a book called How Democracies Die. It's written by two Harvard professors, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, and they also are worried that our democracy might not hold. They're also worried that our system of checks and balances might not be up to the task. They note that democracies die not only by sudden military coups, but a lot of times, they say, the assault on democracy begins slowly. For many citizens, it may at first be imperceptible. After all, elections continue to be held. Opposition politicians still sit in Congress. Independent newspapers still circulate. The erosion of democracy takes place piecemeal, they say, often in baby steps. And part of that piecemeal erosion that we've been facing right here in the United States, they argue, can be seen in the violation of what they call unwritten democratic norms of behavior. And they cite two such norms. One is called, or they call it, mutual toleration by competing parties and political candidates. And the second one is forbearance, or the restraint in the exercise of power. They call these the soft guardrails of American democracy, and they argue, and I agree, that these guardrails have been discarded. It began with Newt Gingrich in the 1990s and his refusal to compromise on the budget, which forced a painful government shutdown. And then, of course, there was Gingrich's insistence on impeachment of Bill Clinton at the same time that Newt Gingrich himself was having an affair. And this ushered in what they call an era of extreme polarization. And we're in an era of extreme polarization, even more so right now. And they warn that extreme polarization itself is a threat to democracy. Another glaring example of the discarding of the guardrails, the soft guardrails of democracy, Mitch McConnell's vow, the day after Obama was inaugurated, that he wanted to make sure Obama was a failure. Or in 2016, Mitch McConnell's decision not to let President Obama's nominee to the Supreme Court, Merrick Garland, even get a hearing, much less a vote. Or look what's going on in Madison today, this week. Talk about a lack of restraint or forbearance in the exercise of power. We have Majority Leader Fitzgerald and Speaker Robin Vos trying to subvert the will of the people, grab as much power as they possibly can, and tie the hands of Tony Evers, even though he was elected. Tie the hands of Josh Kaul, the Attorney General, even though he was elected too. They want even to curtail early voting and to move the date of a presidential primary. Why do they want to do that? So fewer voters actually turn out at election time, because they know that their candidates do better when fewer voters turn out. That is about as anti-democratic, small d, as you can ever have. So those are the guardrails that have been discarded, and it's really important to watch those. One issue I have with How Democracies Die is that I think they neglect a few underlying themes that I just want to touch on here. Underlying problems that have been eroding our democracy long before Donald Trump came down that escalator. And one of those problems is money in politics. This is what we study day in and day out and write about and campaign about at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. As Jimmy Carter acknowledged a couple years ago on Progressive Radio with Tom Hartman, he said, you know, we really don't have a democracy in America anymore. His precise words were, we have an oligarchy of unlimited political bribery. an oligarchy of unlimited political bribery. You and I and everyone in this room and everyone who's watching this on YouTube knows that we don't have as much power as the big contributors in our electoral system. The Koch brothers, or Sheldon Adelson, or Diane Hendricks, or Tom Steyer for that matter. And you might say, well, they're big donors on the left and they're big donors on the right, so it evens out. I don't think it evens out usually because the right has more rich people than the left. But even if it did even out, that's not what our democracy is supposed to be about. Our democracy is not supposed to be a tug-of-war between a handful of left-wing billionaires and a handful of right-wing billionaires. In a democracy, we're all supposed to have an equal tug on the rope. And it's just not the case right now. It's nowhere near the case. And so that's another problem. In addition, there's the crisis of journalism, the crisis of media in America that my friends Bob McChesney and John Nichols have been writing about. You know, I know, newspapers are dying out. There are fewer and fewer reporters to cover what's going on in Washington, fewer and fewer reporters to cover what's going on in the state capitals, and that is just fine and dandy for the corporations and the super wealthy who buy their way through those state capitals every day. Radio and cable TV, after the Fairness Doctrine died in the Reagan era, have become mere shouting matches, campfire rituals for whichever camp you're in. I mean, you can, get up in the morning and watch Fox TV and then listen to Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh and come back and watch Fox News at night and be on an IV drip all day long with Fox News and right-wing radio. And if you're on the left, you can watch Amy Goodman in the morning, you can read The Nation magazine at noon, and you can go home after work and turn on MSNBC or CNN and call it a day. And if you're lucky enough to live in liberal places like the Isthmus of Madison, you will go a week without ever bumping into someone who doesn't agree with you. And this is not healthy. This doesn't build political muscle because you don't have to counter an argument that you bump into that you haven't heard about recently. It doesn't build empathy, and we need empathy in this country. And it's not good politics, because the essence of politics is to convince, is number one, get your own people out, but also number two, to convince some people on the other side that actually your view or our view of what is just and beautiful and right and American is the better way to go. But if we're just in our camps, there's no discussion going on. And one thing that worries me about Wisconsin right now is that there are fewer and fewer places where we can have civil discourse across ideology. I used to be on one Friday every 7 weeks or every 8 weeks, Wisconsin Public Radio Week in Review on Friday mornings. They don't do that show anymore. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, the most powerful newspaper in the state, the most widely read paper anyway, has no op-ed page anymore. There are fewer and fewer spaces in this state where we can have decent civil dialogue. We need those spaces. Another fundamental problem is our grossly unequal economy. We have an economy over the last 30 to 40 years that has been rewarding almost entirely the 1%, and even more so the 0.1%. And when the super rich are the beneficiaries of our economy, it gives them more and more power to buy our political system. And it sows a great deal of resentment, rational, understandable resentment among the people, who will then look for any blowhard with an easy answer, or be susceptible to other appeals, other base appeals, which gets me to the final underlying problem that we have before Trump came around, and that problem is racism. A culture of racism and institutional racism that have persisted in this country since its founding. There were a lot of us who thought when President Obama got elected that maybe we were moving beyond this problem. But the problem is back with a vengeance, and in fact, Obama's election helped to generate this reaction. As an article in the New York Times Magazine over the last couple of weeks demonstrated. So these are kind of the underlying problems that have been corroding the pillars of our democracy before Trump came around. And then there's Trump. And I'm going to talk a bit about this guy we got in the White House who is a pathological narcissist. But that is not the worst of it. The authors of this book, How Democracies Die, they list 4 key indicators of authoritarian behavior. And they show that Donald Trump has met all those indicators. The first is what they call the rejection or weak commitment to the democratic rules of the game. And there are plenty of examples of this. There's Trump's bogus claim that there were millions of illegal immigrant voters. There's his constant assailing of judges from the Ninth Circuit or any judge who disagrees with him or comes down with a ruling that he doesn't like. There's his unprecedented attack on the FBI, the Justice Department, the special prosecutor. Recently, there is his open discussion of pardoning Manafort, which is an extraordinary example of obstruction of justice in and of itself. And then this morning, he was praising Roger Stone, who's also being investigated by the special prosecutor, praising Roger Stone for having the guts, in his terms, for not cooperating with the special prosecutor, rejecting the democratic rules of the game. The second one is the denial of the legitimacy of political opponents. And this is an easy one. You have all the, he's a playground bully. He does, name calling like a 14-year-old or a 10-year-old. Low energy Jeb, lying Ted, crooked Hillary, Pocahontas. I mean, it's absurd that the President of the United States talks in these terms. It's a terrible example for our children, but there you have it. The third thing that they cite is the toleration or encouragement of violence. And this is really creepy. During the campaign, remember, he was at an event and there were some protesters and they were being hauled away, and he said, "Knock the hell out of them. I promise you I'll pay your legal fees." There was his outrageous comment at Charlottesville that there were good people there in that white supremacist rally, a rally where people were carrying the Nazi flag and were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Or take his comment a couple months ago when he praised Montana Republican Representative Gianforte for the guy who assaulted that reporter a while back. And Trump said, "Any guy who can do a body slam, he's my guy." Or maybe you didn't hear this recently. What he said about barbed wire on the border. Barbed wire, used properly, can be a beautiful sight. That's like Robert Duvall in Apocalypse Now saying he loved the smell of napalm in the morning. Or take his recent warning to Antifa, the anti-fascist group. Trump was talking to some conservative publication, and he said that that they should be careful because their opponents, and by that he meant the white supremacists, are much tougher, potentially more violent. He has this fascination with violence, especially right-wing violence. And the fourth thing that they cite is his readiness to curtail civil liberties. The civil liberties of his opponents or of the media. I mean, fake news he talks about. He calls the media the enemy of the people. He suggested that we tighten libel laws so the media can't criticize him or other elected officials. He threatened to go after Jeff Bezos of the Washington Post and increase his postal costs. And then there are other people's civil liberties, like the people who were protesting at the Kavanaugh hearing. We shouldn't have to put up with this kind of stuff, he said. It's embarrassing for the country to allow protesters. Can you imagine? President of the United States. It's embarrassing for the country to allow protesters. He doesn't seem to have read the First Amendment. Or take his remark that the NFL players who were protesting police violence and kneeling during the national anthem, that they should have to leave the country. And then there's his assault on the civil liberties of immigrants. And it's not just the Muslim ban. And it's not just the hideous policy of tearing children, young children, babies from their parents. There's also an executive order that he issued a few days before the Muslim ban, where he said that agents of immigration, ICE agents, could send back anybody, not only who'd been convicted of a crime, not only anyone who'd been arrested at one point for a crime, but anybody who was chargeable with a crime. Now this category of chargeable for a crime is not one that I am familiar with And I don't believe it's in the Constitution of the United States. I'm quite sure it isn't. Whatever happened to innocent until proven guilty? You know, he's only for innocent until proven guilty when it comes to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, evidently. Not when it comes to immigrants. So those are the danger signs according to these scholars. And I wanted to add my own little typology of dangers, if you would, that Trump poses. Because he's not an out-and-out fascist, but he is the closest thing we've ever had to a fascist in the Oval Office, and I think we need to recognize that fact. He's not Adolf Hitler. He hasn't written a treatise. He hasn't written much except a bunch of bad checks. He hasn't written Mein Kampf. He doesn't really have a fully developed ideology. He's been all over the map over his career. He was a liberal at one point. But he's got these inclinations of the fascist. One is he loves strongmen. He loves Putin. He loves Duterte in the Philippines. He's kind of warmed up to Kim Jong-un. And said at one point, kind of laughingly, that, you know, you should see what Kim Jong-un does to people he doesn't agree with. He likes the Saudi royal family. He fantasizes about being president for life. Not making it up. When President Xi of China essentially was given president for life authority, Trump said, "I think it's great. Maybe we'll want to give that a shot someday." Yeah, let that sink in a little bit. And he's a bully, as I said. Fascists revel in bullying. And their supporters revel in their bullying. George Orwell, I came across this term within the last few months. He had a term for this. He called the admirers bully worshippers. And there's something psychologically twisted but so true about that. Trump also echoes the language of the fascists during his presidential campaign and still afterwards. He still talks about America first. That's his slogan. This was the slogan of Nazi sympathizers here in the United States in the late 1930s and 1940 and 1941, right before Pearl Harbor. And Trump cannot plead ignorance to this because he was warned by the Anti-Defamation League during the campaign that this is a slogan that's got a real bad odor. It's got a real bad echo. But it didn't stop him. He put it in his inaugural address and he keeps using it. He's used it in the last week. America first. His constant invocation of fake news, that too has ugly echoes. The Nazis used the term, I don't speak German, so you're going to have to correct me if I mispronounce it, but Lügenpresse, which means lying press in German. In fact, some Trump supporters have picked it up, that phrase Lügenpresse, and are using it, according to Time magazine. Goebbels, Trump's propagandist, used the term enemy of the people constantly to refer to Jews. Trump likes to use the words enemy of the people to refer to the media. A lot of people in the United States, when they hear the term media, think Jews. Jews own the media. Jews are the enemy of the people. It's an easy equation for people to get to. And then there are a few other crucial trademarks of the fascists that Trump kind of embodies. One is incessant lying. Incessant lying. He's going to be in the Guinness Book of World Records for presidential lying. I think he's there already. As of November 1st, he had uttered 6,420 lies or misrepresentations, according to the Washington Post. And his flagrant lying isn't just a character flaw. It's a telltale warning for us. Here's the first sentence from another new and important book this year called The Death of Truth by Michiko Kakutani, who is the longtime book editor at the New York Times. First sentence of the book. Two of the most monstrous regimes in human history came to power in the 20th century, and both were predicated upon the violation and despoiling of truth. Or take Orwell again. The really frightening thing about totalitarianism is not that it commits atrocities, but that it attacks the concept of objective truth. I do want to edit that. I do think one of the really frightening things about authoritarianism is that it commits atrocities, but you get his point. Because the attack on truth gets you to the atrocities, lets you arrive at the atrocities. lets people accept and become acquiescent in and carry out the atrocities. Another trademark of the fascist that Trump embodies is racism or scapegoating. I mean, that Trump is a racist is beyond debate at this point, I think. Look, he didn't rent his apartments to black people. He led the birther movement, which was on its face a racist attack against President Obama. He had this vicious campaign against the Central Park Five black young men wrongly accused of rape in New York City. Even after they were exonerated, he continued to insist on their guilt. He launched his campaign with racist appeals against Muslims and Mexicans. And then after Charlottesville, all doubt was gone. Then, and this is a crucial thing, ultra-nationalism. Ultra-nationalism. Trump makes no bones and just recently copped to being a nationalist. That's what America First is all about. That's what that cap is all about. Make America great again. Make America great again is nothing more than an appeal to people's sense of bereaved national pride and patriotism. An appeal that we should restore the great glory of the country that somehow has been tarnished. And for him, it was tarnished by that black guy in the White House. This kind of appeal, this appeal to a bereaved greatness, has been a crucial appeal of fascists and authoritarians everywhere. Hitler used it, Mussolini used it, Franco used it, Pinochet used it. It is one of the calling cards. And these last two things, racism and ultranationalism, when combined, are extremely toxic. Racism and ultranationalism are the sperm and the egg of fascism. And Trump's doing some in vitro fertilization right there in the Oval Office. Lastly, and not to be dismissed, first of all, before I get to that, ultranationalism at the UW-Madison, George Mossey, professor of history, who's gone now, his family was from Germany, very wealthy family in Germany, Jewish family in Germany. He came here and he wrote books about fascism and warned about nationalism, that nationalism was a really important element of fascism. You can pick up his books on fascism or read some articles he wrote about it. Finally, fascism is a mass-based movement. It's not just you have one megalomaniac in power who's got two generals that he likes who are going to take over the country, as has happened in some other countries. Fascism isn't just authoritarianism in a couple tanks. It is a mass-based movement. And Trump has a mass base. Let's face it, he's got a mass base. His popularity never goes below the freezing mark, certainly. And while it may be, 1/3 of the country or sometimes as high as 47%, that's a lot of people in a country of 320 million people. That is a huge mass base. And within the mass base, he has this violent white supremacist movement that love him. They think he speaks directly to them. They can be counted on to defend him. And so, this is very troubling. The zealousness of those rallies is very troubling to me, that he has. And he needs these rallies once a week to keep his gargantuan ego pumped up. Because if he can't feed off the applause from the crowd, his ego collapses. And then there's this weird, sick symbiosis where he feeds off the racism. Because when he says something that will incite the crowd that's tinged with racism, the crowd goes crazy. And so he loves it when it goes crazy. And so he knows how to feed his ego. And one of the ways he feeds his ego is appealing to racism. And so around and around it goes. I don't want to exaggerate. America is not a fascist state right now. If it were a fascist state, I wouldn't be able to be talking to you. I'd be beaten up. You'd be beaten up as soon as we walked out the door, or the stormtroopers would walk in and disrupt us. We're not there yet. I don't want to exaggerate it. I refused to use the F word for about 35 years in public when I was at the Progressive magazine, because I thought to use the word fascism to describe the United States was a disservice to the people who fought against fascism and the people who died under fascism. But to deny right now that there are clouds of fascism in the sky would be to be an ostrich and hide our head in the sand. And so I'm going to return to this book, How Democracies Die. Because at the outset I said democracy can die in baby steps, in a piecemeal fashion. But they also warned that democracies can die in one fell swoop. And that's what really keeps me up at night. So if you're not depressed enough already, let me give you some more. Here are 3 ways democracy in the United States might die in one fell swoop. First is what's called Norm Ornstein's nightmare. This was written up in the New York Times about 3 months ago. Norm Ornstein is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative think tank. Norm Ornstein has become a liberal over the last 10 years. Still works there. Here's the scenario. Trump fires Mueller, pardons everyone who's had the guts to keep quiet, pardons his sons, pardons his daughter. There are huge protests in the streets. Actually, there would be huge protests that are already being planned by MoveOn.org and other organizations if Trump goes down this route. Confronting those protests are the white supremacists. Trump's zealots and neo-Nazis attack the protesters, violence escalates, Trump declares martial law. Boom. Second, if the United States is attacked again, even at 1/10 of 9/11, all bets are off. As the authors of this book note, major security crises, wars, or large-scale terrorist attacks are political game changers. They represent moments of danger for democracy, the authors say. Leaders who can do whatever they like in such circumstances and can inflict great harm on our democratic institutions. Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, not one of my favorite people, has a new book out called Fascism, A Warning, and she makes the same, she has the same contention that if we're attacked again, we're going to be in trouble. And everything we know about Trump's pathological personality suggests that if we're attacked again, we're going to be in that kind of trouble. And you might think that my mention of the possibility of martial law is hyperbole, some crazy talk from some crazy left-winger. It's not. I'm not the only one who's used the term, or a term analogous to it. Listen to Tommy Franks, General Tommy Franks. General Tommy Franks, who led the Iraq War in 2003 for George W. Bush. He said that if we're ever attacked again by terrorists with weapons of mass destruction, we might have to, in his words, suspend the Constitution. Or listen to another general, General Wayne Downing, who was Condoleezza Rice's deputy at the National Security Council. I was reading the Washington Post one day, and about paragraph 26 came this quote from General Wayne Downing. The United States may have to declare martial law if we're ever attacked again by terrorists who might have biological or chemical weapons. Now, if the generals are talking out loud about martial law, you can bet that their subordinates have drawn up plans for martial law. That's how the military works. And so I can guarantee you that there are plans for martial law on the shelves of the Pentagon, or the shelves of Homeland Security, or the shelves of the FBI, and all Donald Trump would have to do is pull those sketches down. You remember Ted Koppel, don't you? Ted Koppel, who was running Nightline for a couple decades, the founder of Nightline. Ted Koppel warned about this too. It's not just me. Here's what he said at a graduation speech at Berkeley in 2004. More than likely, the use of a chemical or biological weapon in a terrorist attack against the U.S. homeland would lead to the imposition of martial law. Here's the last scenario. I said there were 3 scenarios that will keep you up at night and keep me up at night. This is less likely than the first 2, but it's within the realm of possibility given who Donald Trump is. And that is simply this. Trump is impeached by the House. Trump is convicted by the Senate. Trump doesn't leave. Trump calls the tanks out. You know, Stalin said when someone came up to him and said, the Pope doesn't like your treatment of the Catholics, he responded notoriously, infamously, how many divisions does the Pope have? And I want to ask you, how many divisions does the House of Representatives have? How many divisions does the Senate have? And how many divisions does the Supreme Court have? This was a worry that some people had, like my parents, when Nixon was being impeached. That the guy was crazy enough that he would call out the military. And Trump is commander-in-chief of the military. I don't think everyone in the military, I don't think everyone in the chain of command, I don't think Defense Secretary Mattis would follow that order, but I do think that Trump might be able to find some people in the chain of command further down who would follow the order, and he could fire everyone in between. It's possible. And I also want to put this to you. If for any of these reasons or any other reason, Donald Trump tomorrow morning declared martial law, I'm going to bet my last dollar that tomorrow night Sean Hannity would be on Fox News saying it was a great thing. And so it can happen here. That's the stark fact of the matter. And the fact that it can happen here and is more likely to happen here than I ever would have imagined is something that I think we need to be really mindful of. Here's another indicator of how far things may go. I mean, there was a Washington Post poll last year that said 50% of Republican voters were okay if there's no presidential election in 2020. Washington Post poll. So, you may be wondering, why am I not going to go back to Madison, draw a hot bath, and bring out a razor blade tonight? And let me tell you why. Because there is good news. And the good news is that civil society is not collapsing. Civil society is standing up to Trump. And I studied fascism when I was at college. I studied fascism when I was at the Progressive, and I studied fascism when Trump came upon the scene. And what I gathered from all my studies, and I read a lot of books by scholars of fascism, is that the fascists, even when they come to power, cannot rule in a fascist way, or certainly cannot take it to the disgusting lengths, the deplorable, really ghastly in every way lengths that Hitler took it, unless civil society rolls over. And the beauty of what's been happening in the United States over the last 2 years is that that hasn't happening. That hasn't been happening. Civil society has stood up from day one, or at least from day two, with that great Women's March in Washington, the day after inauguration, or in Madison, where there were 75,000 people. And I was there on Library Mall with all of them, and it was a great crowd. It was a festive crowd. It reminded me of the protests in 2011. There were great costumes and tremendous homemade signs and chants. I remember a lot of young women say, "We don't want your tiny hands anywhere near our underpants." And I thought, that's the kind of spirit that'll get us through. And so the protests have continued. I was at a protest at the Sauk City Bridge a year after the inauguration, on the anniversary of the inauguration, and there were 200 people there with great signs and costumes and great energy. And there were the immigrant rights protests that spontaneously erupted when the Muslim ban came down. My daughter was in Brooklyn and went with some of her friends to LaGuardia. Some people went spontaneously to O'Hare. There were protests all over the place. And here in Wisconsin, we have the great immigrant rights group, Voces de la Frontera, that does tremendous organizing of protests, not just in Milwaukee where they're based, but around the state, where they take workers off the job if immigrants are being assailed. And so there are these wildcat strikes, one-day strikes of immigrant workers around the state, which are wonderful. There's the Me Too movement. There's the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a lot going on at the grassroots, and even in more starchy places, there is resistance, like the courts. One judge after another has knocked down the Muslim ban. And then there was this unprecedented statement by the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Roberts, not exactly a flaming liberal, who came out and rebuked the President of the United States, not from the bench, not in an opinion, but in response to a question from the Associated Press, a question that he could easily have said no comment to. But rather than that, this was after Trump had chastised or criticized someone for being an Obama judge who ruled against one of his immigration policies. Roberts said, we don't have Obama judges or Trump judges, Bush judges or Clinton judges. What we have is an extraordinary group of dedicated judges doing their level best to do equal right to those appearing before them. The independent judiciary, he said, is something we should all be thankful for. Of course, Trump responded that Chief Justice was all wrong about that too, but I cannot remember when a sitting Chief Justice has gone out of his way, outside of the chambers of the Supreme Court, to criticize the President of the United States. So the judges are standing up. The states are standing up. There are a lot of states, attorney generals in a lot of states have been suing the President on a whole range of issues. The media is standing up, with the exception of Fox News, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Trump administration. The media is standing up. You have people in the media finally calling out a president for lying and saying that the president is lying. That's refreshing. The late night TV comics are standing up. I mean, my wife and I watch Stephen Colbert every night just to get some release from the horrors of the news every day, and their mockery is a balm and a good thing for civil society too. Some Republican elected officials have been standing up. You know, John McCain was the most prominent among them, but Jeff Flake and Bob Corker, at least they say the right things. They may vote the wrong way, but they say important things that need to be said. Even Lindsey Graham said, departed from the president last week on Saudi Arabia. So there is some criticism even there. More criticism from Republican or conservative intellectuals and pundits. George Will, David Frum, David Brooks, Jennifer Rubin, Steve Schmidt, who ran McCain's campaign, has been super outspoken about the very threats that I've been talking about, the threats to the actual survival of our democracy. Even Morning Joe and Mika. I mean, Morning Joe's not the leading intellectual of he's not Noam Chomsky. But he has been saying some good things, and he gets to an audience that Chomsky doesn't reach. And it's important that they are standing up and saying, I heard Mika one day saying that, we're going in a very scary direction. And she was referring to democracy going downhill and going into a dictatorship. And so I'll applaud anyone who calls Trump out. I will applaud anyone who warns about the threats to our democracy, no matter what they were doing 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, or 5 years ago, to push this country down the hill, as some were doing. Even Charlie Sykes I'll give an exception to. So I'm happy that these resistances are going on. People by the millions are not taking any of this stuff lying down. We've had great protests against the policies on climate change. We had the Dakota pipeline protests, which were tremendous. So all across the board, on all across these issues, people are standing up. Here in Wisconsin, there's a lot of resistance. There's a resistance to the power grab that's going on right now. There are a lot of groups that have been fighting against money in politics. 141 communities in Wisconsin have voted by overwhelming margins that they want to see the Constitution of the United States amended to say corporations aren't persons and money isn't speech. There's a fight for fair maps against gerrymandering going on all over the state. So these things encourage me. The unity of the nonprofit progressive sector in Wisconsin also encourages me. I'm chairman of the board of a group called Wisconsin Voices, which is an umbrella organization of about 60 progressive nonprofits. And we are all working together under the radar. I mean, this is the ACLU, Midwest Environmental Advocates, Common Cause, League of Women Voters, League of Conservation Voters, everybody under the sun working together, rowing in the same direction. And so that's important. And we saw on November 6th, we saw this tremendous turnout here in Wisconsin. And we saw people across the country voting in huge numbers. And to me, the turnout was a turnout against Trump. This was the first opportunity people have had to register in a formal way their disgust with the direction that the President of the United States is taking our country in. And that is a hopeful sign. Those are the things we need to do to continue to combat the threat of fascism here in the United States. We must vote. We must speak up. We must protest. We also must talk respectfully to our neighbors who don't already agree with us, but who are open to dialogue or susceptible to rational conversation. And we should join organizations, any organization, whichever organization appeals to you most, on whichever issue is most important to you. It's important to be in an organization with other people who are trying to fight back. You can't do it alone. It's too hard to do it alone. It's too discouraging to do it alone. Do it with a friend or a couple friends and have fun doing the work, or else you'll give up, because no one wants to bang their head against the wall. I'm not that masochistic. I've been doing this work for 40 years now. I've been doing it since college when I was active in the anti-apartheid movement. And I remember a representative of the ANC, the African National Congress that Mandela led. This representative said, after he gave a talk on campus, we said, well, come out and have a drink with us. He said, I'm not going to have a drink until apartheid is over. And this was 1979, and apartheid wasn't over for another 10 years or so. And of course, we thought, it's going to end tomorrow because we're being active on the issue, and boom, we'll get instant results. But, that guy had a long view. It helps to take the long view. But I would have a beer, too, while you're doing it. I don't believe in abstinence. So, the main thing is we can't give up. We can't give up. We can't think that it's helpless. We can't think that the odds are so stacked against us that it's just not worth doing. Because that's what the fascists want. That's what Trumps want. That's what Trump wants. That's what authoritarians want. That's what the Koch brothers want. That's what the corporations who have such outsized influence want. They want to run stuff by themselves. And we can't let them do that. They want us to give up. They want us to feel scared. They want us to feel helpless. And while we may feel scared, and sometimes, frankly, I do feel scared, we're not helpless. And we can't give up, and we can't give in, and we can't lie down, and we can't remain silent. We must stand up together. And only by standing up together, and only by speaking out together, can we stop this dreadful direction that this country's heading in. And I'm hopeful today that we're going to win. With a little bit of luck, and we're going to need a little luck, but with a little bit of luck, and I'm a gambler, we'll not only survive the age of Trump, together we will preserve our democracy, and together we will expand our democracy. So I want to thank you for listening. I'm happy to take questions. It's a pleasure to be with you here tonight. Before I do take your questions, I want to just say a thing. I have put 4 handouts out on the table. I want to describe them real briefly. The first is called 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by historian Tom Snyder. He's authored a book that is an expansion of that 2-page leaflet. His book is called On Tyranny, but there are 20 things that he says we should do to resist fascism and the slide toward authoritarianism. Another is a piece I wrote called Donald Trump's 10 Anti-Semitic Dog Whistles. That speaks for itself. The third thing is a wonderful poem that I've treasured for a long time by a poet named Irina Klepfitz. The poem is called Bashert. Bashert is a Yiddish term meaning destiny, or it's meant to be. Her father was a resistance fighter at the Warsaw Ghetto. Jewish. He died hurling himself on a Nazi machine gunner in the ghetto uprising. Her poetry is amazing. That's a sample of it. And lastly, there's a bit of wisdom from Howard Zinn, the great historian who wrote a people's history of the United States. This is a quote that's been on our fridge for about 5 years now. He talks about having hope in hard times, hope in bad times. And I just want to echo and amplify what he said. He said, let's defy all that is bad around us. And I want to add, celebrate all that is good. And in his beautiful words, send the spinning top of a world in a more humane direction. So, thanks very much. Question?
In Wisconsin, we're fortunate to have a couple of
I'll repeat the question too. So.
In Wisconsin, we're fortunate to have 2 groups, at least 2 that I know of. One is the Center for Media and Democracy, and one is the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. Can you explain the difference between the 2? Is one more investigative journalism, sort of, or investigative work? And can you explain your group and its mission and...
Sure.
Okay.
So, two groups she's talking about, Center for Media and Democracy, and my group, which I head, the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. What's the difference? The Center for Media Democracy, Mary Batari is one of the lead reporters for that. That group does ALEC Exposed, this expose of the American Legislative Exchange Council, and exposes a lot of the work of the Koch brothers, not only in Wisconsin, but around the country. They've also done a lot of good reporting on what's going on in Wisconsin under the Walker Wrecking Crew. The Wisconsin Democracy Campaign has been around since 1995. Primarily, we look at the pernicious role of money in politics, especially here in Wisconsin. And so we have a database at our website, and our website is wisdc.org. On our website, where we have coded more than, one guy actually, the same guy has coded more than 1 million donations to political candidates here in Wisconsin, and coded some of the outside dark money groups too. And so you can go to our website and put in, you know, your neighbor's name and see who your neighbor contributes to, or you can put in Scott Walker's name and see who Scott Walker's donors are, and you can click on something that can order them by size, so you can see the biggest donors to Walker to the smallest. We also, in the last couple years, have been focusing on this issue of Trump and fascism. And so we have something on our website called Trump and Fascism that you can find. It is a study guide for learning and for resistance. So we have a definition of fascism from a scholar, and we have Paxton is the scholar's name, but we list other scholarly books that people can go to, scholarly articles on fascism, contemporary articles that discuss Trump and his dovetailing with fascism. So I would highly recommend that people go to our website and look. You can just Google Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, Trump, fascism, and boom, you'll get there. So those are the, we also work in coalition with all these other great nonprofit groups, League of Women Voters, Common Cause, etc. And so that's the work we do. We lobby occasionally at the Capitol. We are a nonprofit. We are a progressive nonprofit. We don't endorse candidates. We don't tell people who not to vote for. But we do comment on what's going on and expose money in politics. We advocate for a democracy, quaintly, where everyone has an equal voice. Yeah.
I guess broadly, what do you think about, or what do you think is the future of the Senate? I think that's something that going forward might be, more pressing, not more pressing, but just that as Trump and others are more making politics more racialized and focusing on the heavily white voters in states like Wyoming and Montana and other smaller states that have more disproportionate representation in the Senate compared to states like California or Wisconsin even. I guess what do you see as the future going forward, especially when the Senate controls things like the Supreme Court nominations and other court nominations?
Excellent questions. The questions about the future of the U.S. Senate and why it should be that people in Montana with a tiny population have the same representation in the Senate as the people of California, for instance. It's interesting, I was just having dinner with Bob McChesney about 10 days ago, and he said, one answer to this is to, number one, get the District of Columbia as a state with 2 senators, Puerto Rico as a state with 2 senators, and then divide California into 3, and have the old California have 6 senators. That is, the 3 different states of what used to be California each have 2 senators, and that would be a way. Or divide up, other populous states so that there's more equal representation. And your question raises the larger question, which is, there's so many ways that we could reform this democracy and make it work better. And, there's ranked choice voting, or what used to be called instant runoff voting. I have a colleague who says, we should get rid of districts. Who knows what their state district is? Why do we have districts? There are all sorts of things. He says, get rid of the 2 Dakotas and make them 1 Dakota. To me, it's I do think ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting is an important change that we might be able to get to. This is where you go into the voting booth, and rather than voting for one person, you vote for your top 3 or top 4 favorites. And then if no one gets a majority, the the person who got the least votes gets thrown out, and the people who voted for that person, they get their second choice, and on it goes until someone has a majority. This works in some cities are doing it already. Maine's doing it. Maine got an election run that way just November 6th with instant runoff voting. So I think that's a reform that can help. Another thing that McChesney and others are talking about is adding justices to the U.S. Supreme Court. There's nothing magical about 9. I think that would cause a firestorm and bring back FDR's packing of the courts. But the issue that I'm working on most is just this amending the U.S. Constitution to overturn the Citizens United decision of 2010. And that's shorthand. Mostly it's for overturning 150 years of bad U.S. Supreme Court decisions that go back all the way to 1888 in Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, where a clerk at the court, not a justice, said that corporations are persons. And from there on, people said, well, on the court, they used it as a precedent that said corporations are persons, as we said before in 1888. And then there are all sorts of other bad decisions that flowed from that. And, there's the 1976 Buckley versus Vallejo that said money is speech. And, McCutcheon decision that said a poor, rich conservative who had already spent $300,000 in campaigns was somehow getting his First Amendment rights infringed upon because he can't spend another $300,000 on other candidates. That was just in 2014. So anyway, overturning this whole doctrine of corporate personhood and money equals speech is one of the areas I'm working on. But I'm open to all sorts of creative democratic reforms like the ones you mentioned, or alluded to anyway, yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What about the concern and the talk about choosing two extreme liberal candidates in 2020? Do you think that could be a problem? Is it worrisome? Is it going to happen? What's your thoughts on it?
Well, I don't know if it's going to happen. I don't have a crystal ball, but I don't think there's a problem with choosing candidates that are too liberal. I think what we saw in 2016 was that the American people are sick of politics as usual and sick of politicians as usual. That's why, at least in Wisconsin, the two most popular candidates running for president was a guy who was a egotistical talk show, reality TV show host, and the other guy was a Jewish socialist from Vermont who'd never combed his hair in his life. And I just don't think people want cardboard politicians anymore, and it doesn't matter whether what their politics are if they're speaking with some authenticity and speaking to people's real felt needs. And so I think, that's why Bernie Sanders remains popular to this day. So I'm not worried about running candidates that are too liberal. I think, and I don't tell people who to vote for, I think the Democrats would be well served, though, if they chose someone who speaks with real authenticity about real and speaks with some vision.
Yeah, could you comment on the role of desperation in the development of fascism at all?
Yeah, desperation in the development of fascism. I mean, this is one of the things that worries me about capitalism. Capitalism devouring our democracy. It's munching away at it right now. And it's not giving people the goods anymore. And people are really resentful of that. And people are feeling desperate. People understand that they are treading water at best. 11 million people lost their homes in 2008, 2009. They've not been made whole, even though the folks on Wall Street have been made whole and then some. People understand that their kids are worse off than they are going to be worse off. And so people are resentful and feeling desperate and will be more susceptible to appeals from egomaniacs and fascists and authoritarians. And so that is one of the main concerns I have right now. And, it may be that there'll be a fascist coming down the road who's more talented than Trump, who is more stable than Trump, and more capable of delivering the nasty than Trump. Someone said we have something tempered by incompetence, and that Trump is so incompetent that his incompetence is saving us from the worst, and maybe that's true. And so, maybe there's a more competent fascist down the road who will feed on the desperation that you're talking about.
Are you tracking the number of fascists that are serving in the national government now, or is some other organization? Because there are many who are in the news media who apparently have fascist leanings, whether they realize they're fascist yet or not. I don't know, but you see them daily in the news media.
I mean, am I tracking the number of fascists in elected office is the question, and the answer short is no, but there are groups that I think are doing it. What is the group in the South? Southern Poverty Law Center. That is a good one. The Anti-Defamation League is another. Steve King, the Iowa congressman, certainly comes to mind. So there are some really far-right folks out there in elected office, and there was a neo-Nazi in Illinois who was running who didn't win, but got an amazing level of support from where I stand anyway. Gordy.
Matt, is there a wave of nationalism going on throughout Europe and Italy and Germany seems to be changing course, and South America is changing. Leaders are becoming much more,
Yeah.
right-wing.
The question is there a wave of nationalism all over the world? And, of course, the answer to that is yes. And what is causing that wave? To me, the real cause of it isn't immigration, which many of these countries are feeding on. It is the bankruptcy of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has not delivered the goods. Free trade has not delivered the goods. The European Union, with its free trade doctrine, did not deliver the goods to people. And as a result, people are looking for old answers. And this appeal to nationalism is a really powerful force. I remember seeing a lecture by the old UW historian Harvey Goldberg 30 years ago, who gave a lecture on World War I and how the international working class completely abandoned their principles and jumped on each nationalism that they were, so the Brits were, the workers in Britain joined up with Britain. The workers of Germany joined up with Germany. The workers of Italy joined up with Italy. Instead of saying, this is a crazy war that's going to help, the upper class everywhere, and it's going to hurt workers everywhere, and it's workers who are going to die. So this is a very, very powerful force, nationalism, and when things are going south for people, they resort to an ideology that has a big tug. And so, it's one of the reasons Howard Zinn, wrote something on July 4th for the Progressive saying, put away your flags, we don't need nationalism anymore. Nationalism, dangerous. And so I worry about it. I worry about nationalism. I worry about the failure of the European Union to design the euro and to design its economic agreements with its countries in a sufficient way that they could respond when the economy goes south, and they haven't been able to do it. And so you have Brexit, and so you have the people of Greece suffering, and a real fascist movement in Greece. You have this fascist movement in Hungary and in Poland, and you've got it in Brazil now. Nationalism, very dangerous force. Mike.
A couple of days ago, he may have said it before, but Trump talked or floated the possibility of nationalized media. Do you think he's working on it, or is that just more hot air?
Oh, I think it's hot air. The weird thing about Trump, but he could do anything, so I don't put anything past him. And if he starts shutting down the media, as he tried with the CNN reporter Jim Acosta, things are going really bad, really fast. But he really doesn't want to be president of the United States when he was running. That's the weird thing about the scandal that's coming out. I mean, he wanted to run Trump News, or he wanted to, do the hotel in Moscow and just get richer and richer and richer. But I don't think he's, the day he shuts down CNN or MSNBC is the day our democracy's over. And I don't know if that's the first thing he's likely to do.
I fight with this on a daily basis. I don't understand Congress's complicity with Trump. they don't seem to reject anything. They don't stand up to him. I don't see anybody getting up and voicing. I mean, temporarily you hear somebody flake or somebody will come out and say a few things and then vote right along with Trump. How do we explain this complicity? I mean, they are allowing this to happen to our country. They're not doing anything. They're just standing there observing. And as far as I'm concerned, they're totally complicit.
Yeah. So Congress is complicity with Trump, and I would just amend that to say the Republican Party's complicity with Trump, the elected leaders in Congress in the Republican Party. And the author of this book, they said that Republicans in office or Republicans who are retired, who have a following, who used to be in office, had a moral obligation in 2016 to tell everybody not to vote for Trump because Trump was such a danger to our democracy. And all those Republicans abdicated their moral responsibility and historical responsibility. And, you know, they're still abdicating their moral and historical responsibility. And so I agree with you. I don't, the question is, why are they doing it? They are cowards. They want to stay elected. That's the prime motive of most politicians, not all. The prime motive of most politicians is to stay elected. And they know, if you're a Republican elected official, that if you criticize Trump, your chances of getting reelected are small because the party is not going to support you anymore. The party is going to run someone to the right of you who actually does support Trump. And you will be primaried, as they call it, and you're going to lose your job. And so there are not enough people who say, it's more important to me to stand up for principle than it is to be elected. You know who the happiest person in Wisconsin is? Dale Schultz. Dale Schultz is the happiest man in Wisconsin. And do you know why he's the happiest man in Wisconsin? Because he stood up to his party and said, I don't care if I'm reelected or not, I'm going to vote against this bill. And he did it a couple times. He voted against Act 10 and he voted against the mining bill, and he basically told Scott Fitzgerald to go take a flying leap. And why more people don't do that right now in the Wisconsin State Senate, and I'm hoping that a couple good senators will, like Rob Coles of Green Bay, for instance, or Luther Olson, Columbia County. But the answer to your question is most don't because they want to stay in power. Their love of power is so great, their psychological need to be called senator is so powerful that they cannot do otherwise.
I guess I want to say they can see the direction, though, we're going.
They can, and shame on Lindsey Graham. You know, I did give him a clap there earlier, a faint clap, but shame on him for becoming a Trump toady. During the campaign, he was speaking out against Trump. A lot of people were. Walker was. Others were. And you know, then, well, look at the ridiculous senator in Texas, Ted Cruz. Trump called his wife ugly and said his father was in on the assassination of JFK, and still he calls him down and gives him a hug and thanks him for coming to campaign for him because his job, his title, was so important to him that he would debase himself in front of this buffoon who had so criticized him and his family. It's pathetic.
What do you think is the optimal approach to racism for our society?
Well, the optimal approach to racism, I don't have a formula, but I think we all in all our everyday lives need to confront racism. And we need to call out people who are being racist. And we need to stand up to it and say it's not okay. And it's just such a huge problem. And it's so easily exploited. And, you know, Walker exploits it with his welfare, so-called welfare policies. Trump exploits it terribly. And, I mean, it just amazes me that it's so flagrant right now. But, yeah, I just think we need to call it out, and we need to work against it in our communities. It's better just working in our... The best politics is in your community. You know, occasionally going to Washington, D.C. for a big rally like the Women's March was a great thing. But I think, you know, marching on the Sauk City Bridge is more important than going to Washington. Or marching here in Baraboo. And just confronting racism and white supremacy. It's startling that white supremacy is so overt right now. And I know there are a lot of people who think, affirmative action is bad and all this other stuff, but we need to try to combat that and get, I think white folks need to talk to white folks.
Politics has always been exciting for me because it was a part of our family. Are we doing enough in our school to make it an important part of our school? We have kids from Europe that come and live with us on our farm. They know more about our political system than our kids do. What are we doing in our school?
Right. So are we doing enough in our schools to teach about politics? And I haven't studied the curriculums, but I know that civic education is not as present as it used to be in the schools. And we need civic education, basic civics. I mean, it's amazing the level of ignorance on some basic civic questions that there is among the people of this country right now. And so civic education is important. The League of Women Voters is trying to do a lot on civic education. Kathy Kramer at the University of Wisconsin is doing a lot on civic education. I think it's crucial. We need to let people, at a base level, people should know how our democracy works and how it doesn't work. And you're absolutely right. The people all over the world many of them have a better understanding of what's going on in the United States than we do. We're very parochial, and we don't know what's going on in their country, and some of us know what's going on in our own country. And so that's part of the problem we're looking at right now. Yes, in the back.
Can you talk a little bit about Mike Pence's role in all of this when we're talking about Donald Trump a lot, but do you see this move toward fascism getting worse under a Pence presidency rather than a Trump presidency, or?
Well, it's an interesting question.
I'm just curious about him.
Vice President Pence, and what danger does he pose? I don't think he's a fascist in the way that Trump is. And I don't think he has the appeal at the base that Trump has. I don't think he can get people in the streets or go crazy at his rallies like Trump can. He's a religious fanatic. He's kind of a religious freak. And he's dangerous in his own right. But I don't think he poses the same kind of dangers that Trump does. I don't want to minimize his fanaticism, but this mass-based movement that Trump can galvanize, I don't see Pence being able to galvanize. That's the only good thing I can say about Mike Pence. Other questions?
The demographic seems to be relatively clear that the political future is to a large extent going to be in the hands of minorities, and that we're going to have a need for a minority of blacks and Hispanics to join together in understanding the multicultural kind of characteristics of our society. Would you discuss that for a moment?
Sure, the demographic change in this country, it's a really good thing. I mean, what's happening is that, first of all, young people, if you look at it by age, are becoming much more progressive. They're less racist, they're less bigoted about gays and lesbians than anyone else. They're less devoted to capitalism than other segments of the population. That's young people. I think that's a promising sign. Blacks and Hispanics and other people of color will be a majority by the year 2040 or 2050. And that's part of the backlash that we're facing right now, because white folks are worried about privilege being taken away. Whether they worry about that explicitly or whether they worry about that subconsciously, it's out there. I do think that African Americans, blacks and Hispanics are working together in a lot of ways, nationally and here in Wisconsin. I see it here in Wisconsin through my work at Wisconsin Voices, so that we have groups like Voces de la Frontera and 9 to 5 and the African American Roundtable in Milwaukee, and a group called Black Leaders Organizing Committee in Milwaukee, all working together I don't see their interests diverging, and I think they recognize many of these organizations anyway, and I'm friends with folks at the at the NAACP in Madison, that their interests are aligned. Speaking of the NAACP in Madison, they sent a letter to the school board here in Baraboo and have not heard back from the school board about the incident, and they're very eager to help out and come up here and do some workshops if need be, and I hope there will be at least the courtesy of communication there. Gordy.
The long reach of the United States over the last many decades has been to, from World War II, been having military bases throughout Europe and other parts of the world. And Trump seems to want to bring all that back home. And I don't know, I think our reach has also been to many countries of the world in giving them money through our largesse and their benefit to help their economies. I read about this Jeremy Rifkin, he's a professor from Wharton. He's been working with China, Germany, France, and he bases his work on three things: communications, transportation, and energy. And I'm thinking that our links with all these different various countries over the years has given us, has spread the English language, at least as a worldwide language. So we have a great benefit there to our military occupation, which probably doesn't have a need in a lot of those countries as much as it used to. But would you speak on that?
Well, Gordy talks about the military reach of this country with bases in all over Europe, actually in more than 100 countries, more than 120 countries. And Trump may want to bring that back or not, and plus we have this economic influence all over the world. It's an important point. The United States is an empire. And we need to recognize ourselves as an empire, and being an empire is antithetical to being a democracy. We're ruling other countries one way or another. The one thing that Trump has done that I am in favor of is peace with North Korea. There's no reason the Korean War should still be going on now, 56 years since the end of it, or 66 years since the end of it. There's no reason why we should be threatening nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula. And if he is able, through some combination of luck and narcissism and love of dictators like Kim Jong-il, to bring the nuclear threat and nuclear game of chicken off the peninsula of Korea, that would be a good thing. But I don't think he's going to bring troops home from bases around the world. He's trying to cajole other countries to pay more for their own military because he views himself as an agent of Lockheed Martin. I mean, that's what he's been doing with Saudi Arabia. We need these arms contracts. I mean, the President of the United States is a salesman for the U.S. military contractors. That's what the empire has come down to right now, and that's pretty sad. Gail.
Matt, this is an audience of civil activists. You've got people there who have marched. We pounded on doors. We pounded keyboards. Today we were on the phones. We were doing the work of democracy. Some of us feel like our voice is not being heard. What is the one act of civil disobedience that you would recommend that we do?
we can't let this happen. We cannot let Trump and other forces and white supremacists destroy this democracy. We can't let it happen. And I like one other thing that he says in that 20 steps, that people who carry weapons, soldiers and police, need to recognize that they have a constitutional obligation to enforce the Constitution. And actually, Jim Mattis, evidently by some of these press reports, has already disobeyed an order from Trump. I don't know what the order was, but he told Trump, I'm not going to do that, it's unconstitutional. So, I think there can be civil disobedience up and down. Yes?
Is that I was sitting at the lunch table at work with a bunch of people, and someone made a casual comment about that anything the government does is worse than private industry doing it. And everybody at the table was just completely quiet. It was just a comment that would have just completely just slid right by as just an assumed thing that everybody says. And being who I am, I said, knowing the person was fairly conservative, I said, well, what about the cops and the firefighters and the military? And he turned and said, oh, you got me there. But my point wasn't that I got him. I wasn't actually trying to get him. All I was trying to do was to have somebody in the room not agree. And it doesn't matter whether it makes a difference. It's the climate, I think, that doesn't. People avoid that stuff. It's the climate we need.
And there is power, and thank you very much for standing up, speaking your mind. There is real power in just speaking up in a situation like that, or when someone is saying something racist, or when someone is saying something sexist. You can do it. It doesn't take a tremendous amount of courage. It may be violating the norm of let's just all be quiet and friends here. But, at some point, you don't have to yell either. You can just say, I think you're absolutely wrong because of this. Or I wouldn't say it that way. That's rude. That offends people. Whatever. And the point that you made is a really crucial point, because the propaganda we've been fed for 30 or 40 years now from the Koch brothers and from all those right-wing foundations and from all those right-wing media sources is so crude, but this is it. Everything public is bad. Everything private is good. This has been hammered into our heads for so long, some people just accept it as a given. Now, government is the only institution that we have at least ostensible power over. We don't have power over corporations. I mean, we talk about we love democracy in this country. Most people in this country are working for dictatorships from 9 to 5. And we need to say that, there are good things about the public sector. There are good things about public universities. There are good things about public schools. There are good things about public parks. There's good things about the firefighters and the cops and the snowplowers. And don't let people get away with saying, GM does it better, ExxonMobil does it better, Apple does it better, Amazon does it better, Facebook does it better. I don't think people are saying that about Facebook anymore. Last question.
One thing that I try to keep in mind, ever since Gordon Gekko said greed is good in the movie Wall Street, we've seen this increased separation of the haves and have-nots. So one thing that I try to keep in mind is vote with your dollars. I found out every Koch brothers product that I would buy, but I will not buy now. And so I consciously make an attempt to avoid the products that are by the corporation, that are created by the corporations that have such a strong influence over our democracy. I wonder if you have a thought on that.
Well, I do think that's a good thing. I think consumer choice is one way we can have an influence over corporations. And people can go to ALEC Exposed and find out about American Legislative Exchange Council and find out about the Koch brothers from the Wisconsin Center for Media and Democracy. But I do think, even though I used to work for Ralph Nader and I'm all about consumer power, I think the two best institutions for curtailing corporate power are government regulation and unions. And that's why we've seen over the last 30 years this wholehearted assault on unions and government regulations. If they can get rid of government regulations and if they can crush unions, Corporations can go exploit workers to their heart's content, destroy the environment to their heart's content, exploit consumers to their heart's content. So I think those two institutions are crucially important, but I do think in our everyday dollar consumerism, we need to be conscious and deliberate and make right choices. So thanks very much. I really appreciate it.